They say money can't buy class, but it can certainly buy a lot of silence. Richard Harrington thought he had it all: the billion-dollar tech empire, the adoration of the press, and the young glamorous mistress he was parading around New York's most exclusive gala. Tonight was supposed to be his victory lap. He took the microphone, looked the elite of Manhattan in the eye, and publicly praised his mistress while erasing his wife of 20 years from his life story. The crowd gasped, but the silence that followed wasn't out of respect. It was because the back doors had just swung open, and the wife he thought he'd destroyed had just walked in, and she wasn't alone. The chandeliers inside the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom didn't just sparkle. They seemed to judge. It was the annual Celestial Gala, the kind of event where a ticket cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and the air smelled of expensive perfume, old money, and desperation. In the center of the room, holding court, like a feudal lord, stood Richard Harrington. At 52, Richard was undeniably handsome, in a way that suggested regular dermatological interventions and a personal trainer on a retainer. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand and Bella Sinclair in the other. Bella was 24, a former swimsuit model turned brand ambassador, though no one could quite figure out what brand she represented other than Richard's ego. She was wearing a dress that was less of a garment and more of a suggestion, a shimmering slip of crimson silk that clung to her like a second skin. It was the kind of dress you wore to make a statement, and the statement was, "I won." "Richard, darling," Bella cooed, her voice carrying just loud enough for the board members of Harrington Tech to hear. "You really must tell them about the merger. It's simply genius." Richard beamed, squeezing her waist possessively. "Patience, Bella. Let the boys drink their wine first." Around them, the elite of New York society sipped champagne and whispered. The gossip was radioactive. Everyone knew the timeline. Richard hadn't just left his wife Victoria. He had essentially evicted her. Victoria Harrington, the woman who had reportedly written the code for Richard's first software while he was out schmoozing investors, had been ghosted by her own husband. "I heard he served her the papers via a drone delivery," whispered Mrs. Van Doren, a doyenne of the Upper East Side, shielding her mouth with a fan, while she was at her mother's funeral. "Tacky," her companion muttered. "But look at him. Stock is up 40%. Money forgives a lot of sins." Richard felt invincible. The ink on the divorce papers wasn't even dry. Technically, the lawyers were still warring over the assets. But in his mind, Victoria was ancient history. She was the dusty past of ramen noodles and small apartments. Bella was the future. She was the trophy that proved he was still young, still virile, still the alpha. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on his rival Arthur Pennyworth. Arthur was old money, boring, safe, and currently glaring at Richard with thinly veiled disgust. Richard raised his glass to Arthur with a smirk. Jealous, Richard thought. They're all jealous. "Ladies and gentlemen," the booming voice of the MC announced, cutting through the chatter. "Please take your seats. The keynote address by our Man of the Year, Mr. Richard Harrington, will begin shortly." Bella squeezed his arm. "Showtime, baby." Richard adjusted his cufflinks. They were diamond-encrusted, a gift from Bella, bought with his credit card. He walked toward the stage, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He felt the heat of the spotlight hitting his face. This was his moment. He was going to rewrite the narrative tonight. He was going to cement Bella as his partner and erase Victoria from the collective memory of New York. He didn't know that in the shadows of the mezzanine, a security guard was speaking into his earpiece. target is taking the stage," the guard murmured. "Copy that. The package has arrived at the north entrance." Richard gripped the podium. The microphone gave a sharp whine of feedback before settling. He looked out at the sea of faces, 500 of the wealthiest people on the eastern seaboard. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice smooth, practiced. "Thank you all." Applause rippled through the room, polite but reserved. They were waiting to see how far he would go. When I started Harrington Tech 20 years ago, Richard began adopting his humble visionary persona. I had nothing but a laptop and a dream. People told me I was crazy. They told me to get a real job. They said I didn't have the pedigree to run with the big dogs. He paused for effect. This was the part where he usually credited Victoria. In every speech for the last 2 decades, this was the moment. He would say, "And I couldn't have done it without my wife Victoria, who kept the lights on when we couldn't pay the bill." The regulars in the crowd leaned in. Would he say it, but Richard continued, his voice hardening slightly. "I learned that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones holding you back. Sometimes you outgrow the people who knew you when you were small, because they can't comprehend how big you've become." A collective gasp, soft as a breeze, went through the room. He was publicly burying her. Success requires evolution. Richard said, his eyes locking onto Bella, who was beaming from the front table, blowing him a kiss. It requires a partner who understands the vision of the future, not someone stuck in the past. It requires vitality, energy, beauty. He raised his hand, gesturing to Bella. "I want to thank the woman who has been my rock through this incredible year of growth. Bella, stand up, darling." Bella stood waving like a pageant queen. A few people clapped, mostly Richard's employees who feared for their jobs. The rest sat in stunned silence. This was a breach of etiquette, so severe it was almost impressive. Bella saw the man I was becoming, not the man I used to be. Richard declared, his ego swelling to fill the room. "She supported me when I had to make the hard decisions to trim the dead weight from my life. And let me tell you folks, shedding that dead weight has made me fly higher than ever." Dead weight. He had just called the woman who raised his 2 children and built his back-end architecture dead weight. So, Richard raised his glass, ignoring the tension in the room. To the future, to new beginnings, and to upgrading in business and in life. He tipped the glass to his lips. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a thunderclap. Richard frowned, lowering his glass. Why weren't they clapping? Why were people in the back rows turning around in their chairs? Why was Arthur Pennyworth looking toward the rear entrance with a smirk that looked like he'd just won the lottery? Richard squinted against the spotlight. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom, usually kept locked for security, were slowly groaning open. A draft of cool air swept into the room, causing the candle flames on the tables to flicker wildly. The sound of heels clicking on the marble floor echoed. Click, click, click. Distinct, sharp, unhurried. Richard froze. He knew that walk. But it couldn't be. Victoria was in Connecticut, wallowing in misery. She was supposed to be a broken woman hiding from the world in oversized sweaters, crying over photo albums. The figure stepped into the light. It was Victoria. But it wasn't the Victoria Richard remembered. The woman walking down the aisle wasn't wearing the sensible, modest pantsuits Richard had forced her to wear for years to look matronly. She was wearing a midnight blue gown, structured and sharp, that looked like it cost more than Richard's entire first house. It was cut low in the back, revealing skin that was luminous. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, was cut in a sleek, ruthless bob that framed a face devoid of wrinkles and full of cold, hard calculation. She didn't look sad. She didn't look angry. She looked expensive. And she wasn't alone. Tucked into the crook of her arm was a hand. A large, tanned hand attached to a man in a tuxedo that made Richard's bespoke suit look like a rental. The man was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and a jawline that could cut glass. He walked with a predator's grace, scanning the room not with arrogance, but with boredom. A murmur erupted in the crowd, louder this time. "Is that—" someone whispered near the front. "No, it can't be. Oh my God." Mrs. Van Doren gasped, clutching her pearls for real this time. "That's Sebastian Cole." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Sebastian Cole, the shipping magnate, the man who owned the ports Richard's hardware needed to pass through, the man who was rumored to be a recluse living on a private island in the Mediterranean, worth 3 times what Richard was worth on his best day. Why was Victoria Harrington, the dead weight, walking arm in arm with the most elusive billionaire on the planet? Victoria stopped 10 feet from the stage. She looked up at Richard, her eyes locking onto his. There was no love there. No hate, even. Just the look a scientist gives a bug before pinning it to a board. She smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Sorry we're late," Victoria said, her voice clear and projecting to the back of the room without a microphone. "We had trouble finding parking for the helicopter." Bella, sensing the attention shifting, stood up abruptly, knocking her chair over. "Who do you think you are? You weren't invited. This is Richard's night." Sebastian Cole turned his gaze toward Bella. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her with a mild curiosity, as if she were a noisy parrot. Then he looked at Richard. "Richard." Sebastian said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "Excellent speech, especially the part about upgrading. I couldn't agree more." He pulled Victoria closer, kissing her temple. "I certainly feel I've made the upgrade of a lifetime." The silence in the ballroom had curdled into a thick, suffocating tension. 500 pairs of eyes darted between the stage, where Richard stood with his mouth slightly agape, and the center aisle where Victoria and Sebastian stood, like royalty, inspecting a peasant uprising. Richard's mind was racing, the gears grinding against the rust of his own arrogance. Sebastian Cole. It wasn't just that he was wealthy. Cole was a phantom. He didn't go to galas. He didn't do photo ops. He bought islands to get away from people like Richard. Seeing him here was like seeing a unicorn at a hot dog stand. And seeing him with Victoria, it was a glitch in the matrix. "Security!" Richard barked, his voice cracking slightly. The microphone amplified the crack, sending a screech through the speakers that made everyone wince. "Get them out of here! This is a private event!" 2 beefy security guards in ill-fitting blazers stepped forward, looking uncertain. They looked at Richard, then they looked at Sebastian Cole. Sebastian didn't move. He simply raised one eyebrow, a micro-expression of amusement that radiated more power than Richard's entire speech. He reached into his tuxedo jacket. The guards tensed. Sebastian pulled out a sleek black invitation card with gold leaf embossing. He flicked it between his fingers. "Actually, Richard," Sebastian said, his voice calm and carrying effortlessly, "I believe this table, Table 1, the Platinum Sponsor Table, is reserved for the largest shareholder of the evening. Is it not?" Richard scoffed a nervous, jagged sound. "I'm the largest shareholder. I own 51% of the voting stock. Stop this charade, Victoria. Who did you pay to get him here? Is this an escort service thing?" The crowd gasped. Mrs. Van Doren actually dropped her fan. Victoria laughed. It wasn't the polite, nervous laugh Richard was used to hearing when he made bad jokes at dinner parties. It was a dark, rich sound. "Oh, Richard," she said, stepping closer to the stage. She looked up at him, the stage lights catching the diamonds at her throat, diamonds that spelled out a constellation Richard didn't recognize. "You really haven't looked at the cap table since you filed for divorce, have you? You've been too busy picking out accessories." She glanced at Bella. Bella, feeling the heat of the room, decided to fight fire with a tantrum. She stomped to the edge of the stage, pointing a manicured finger at Victoria. "You're just jealous," Bella shrieked, her voice shrill and unpolished compared to the smooth baritones of the billionaires. "Look at you. Your old Richard doesn't want you. He wants vitality. He said so. Go back to your knitting." Sebastian turned his head, slowly, to look at Bella. "Young lady," he said, "I suggest you sit down before you say something that will make you uninsurable." "I don't have to listen to you," Bella spat. "Bella, quiet," Richard hissed, grabbing her arm. He looked back at Victoria, sweat beading on his forehead. "What are you talking about, Victoria?" "The cap table is locked." "Was locked," Victoria corrected, "until this morning." She turned to the crowd, addressing the room with the poise of a seasoned CEO. "You see, everyone," Victoria announced. "Richard loves to tell the story of the garage, the me against the world story. But he forgets one detail. When we started the company, we didn't have cash for the servers. My father, God rest his soul, put up the collateral, and in exchange he held a lien on 20% of the founding shares. A lien that was dormant." Richard went pale. He remembered the lien. It was a dusty piece of paperwork from 1999. He had assumed it died when Victoria's father passed away. "When you served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral," Victoria said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming ice cold, "you triggered a clause in the trust. Marital dissolution due to infidelity activates the repayment clause immediately." "I can repay it," Richard shouted. "I'll write a check right now. How much is it?" $2,500,000. "The principal was small," Victoria admitted, "but the interest, it was compounded quarterly for 20 years, and the penalty for non-payment was equity conversion." She smiled, and it was the scariest thing Richard had ever seen. "I didn't want the money, Richard. I wanted the shares, and since I didn't have the liquidity to exercise the option alone, I brought in a partner." She squeezed Sebastian's arm. Sebastian nodded to the crowd. "Harrington Tech is a messy ship," he said, sounding like he was discussing a broken toaster. "But the underlying architecture, Victoria's architecture, is sound. So I bought the debt, and then I converted it." Richard did the math in his head. The 20% lien converted at the original valuation, plus penalties. "That dilutes me," Richard whispered. The microphone caught it. "That drops me to 31%, Sebastian finished. "And since Victoria owns her original 15%, and I now own 20%, and we've spent the afternoon making some very interesting phone calls to the other board members." Sebastian gestured to table 2, where the board of directors sat. They were all looking down at their plates, refusing to meet Richard's eyes. All except Arthur Pennyworth, who was grinning like a shark. "You can't do this," Richard stammered. "This is my company. My name is on the building." "For now," Victoria said. She turned and walked toward table 1, the table right in front of the podium, the one reserved for the guest of honor. She sat down, her blue dress pooling around her like water. Sebastian sat next to her. "Please," Victoria said, gesturing to the podium where Richard stood, shaking. "Continue your speech, Richard. You were telling us about dead weight. I'm fascinated. Tell me more about how you shed the things that were holding you back." The room was silent. Every eye was on Richard. He looked at his cue cards. They were trembling in his hands. He looked at Bella, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and horror, realizing that the infinite credit card might have just hit its limit. Richard tried to speak, but his throat was dry as sand. He had been publicly praised his mistress, only to be publicly castrated by his wife. Richard croaked. "Louder, darling," Victoria called out, taking a sip of Sebastian's wine. "We can't hear you in the cheap seats." The gala did not end. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, a public execution is just dinner theatre. The waiters, sensing the shift in power, began refilling the glasses at Victoria and Sebastian's table with a little more alacrity than they did for the head table. Richard had stumbled off the stage claiming a sudden migraine. He had retreated to the VIP green room, leaving Bella stranded at their table. Bella, realizing her meal ticket was currently hyperventilating backstage, tried to brazen it out. She sat alone, scrolling furiously through her phone, likely deleting Instagram posts captioned CEO Life. Meanwhile, the real meeting was happening at Table 1, Arthur Pennyworth. Richard's oldest rival slid into the empty seat next to Sebastian. "Sebastian!" Arthur nodded, ignoring the fact that he hadn't been invited to sit. "Victoria, you look formidable." "Hello, Arthur," Victoria said. She didn't smile. She didn't need to appease these men anymore. "I assume you received the packet my lawyers sent over at 4:00 p.m. "I did," Arthur said, reaching for a breadstick. "Aggressive. You're calling for an emergency board vote of no confidence in the CEO tomorrow morning." "Tonight," Sebastian corrected smoothly. "Electronic voting is open until midnight. We have the bylaws right here." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Tonight, ruthless. I like it. But Richard still has loyalists. The CTO Miller worships the ground Richard walks on. And the CFO is his cousin." "The CFO," Victoria said, cutting into her filet mignon, "has been embezzling from the pension fund to pay for his gambling debts in Macau. We have the receipts. Sebastian's forensic accountants are very thorough." Arthur choked on his breadstick. "Good God!" "He'll vote with us in exchange for a quiet resignation and no jail time," Sebastian said. "That gives us 51% of the vote. But we want a landslide. We want you, Arthur." Arthur looked at Richard's empty chair on the stage. He looked at Bella, who was currently snapping at a waiter for bringing her sparkling water instead of still. "What's in it for me?" Arthur asked. "Richard is incompetent, yes, but the stock is high. Chaos hurts my portfolio." "Stability," Victoria said. "Richard is a showman. He pumps the stock with vaporware and buzzwords. But the core product, the AI interface, is failing. It's buggy. I wrote the original kernel, Arthur. I know where the cracks are. Richard hasn't patched them because it's not sexy to spend money on back-end maintenance. He's been spending R&D budget and on marketing." She glanced at Bella again. "If the system crashes, and it will within 6 months, the stock goes to zero," Victoria continued. "I'm proposing a restructuring. I return as interim CEO. Sebastian provides a liquidity injection to stabilize the transition. We fix the product. We fire the brand ambassadors. We get back to engineering." Arthur looked at Victoria. He had known her for 20 years as Richard's wife, the quiet woman who organized the Christmas parties and remembered his kids' birthdays. He had never looked at her and seen a titan. "You wrote the Colonel?" Arthur asked, skeptical. "Page 45 of the prospectus," Victoria said. "The VH protocol. Who did you think VH was? Very high tech." Arthur chuckled. "I always assumed it was virtual heuristic or some nonsense Richard made up." "Victoria Harrington," Sebastian said softly. "The code bears her initials. It always has." Arthur tapped the table. He looked at his watch. "Voting closes at midnight." 11:59 p.m., Victoria said. Arthur pulled out his phone. "I'm in, but on one condition." "Name it," Sebastian said. "I want to see his face when you tell him." Just then the doors to the green room burst open. Richard Harrington emerged, looking disheveled. He had splashed water on his face, but it couldn't wash away the panic in his eyes. He had clearly been on the phone with his lawyers, and the news hadn't been good. He marched toward table 1, ignoring the hushed whispers of the crowd. He stopped in front of Victoria. "You can't do this," Richard snarled, abandoning all pretense of civility. "I built this me. I was the face, I was the voice. And I was the brain," Victoria said, not even looking up from her plate. "And the brain is tired of the mouth taking all the credit." "I'm offering you a settlement," Richard said, his voice trembling. $10 million. Cash, tonight. Just walk away. Leave the shares. Go live on an island with him." Sebastian laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound. "Richard, I carry $10 million in my travel wallet. Do you really think you can buy her off?" "This isn't about money, Richard," Victoria said, finally looking up. Her eyes were hard. "This is about the disrespect. You stood on that stage and called me dead weight. You erased 20 years of my labor, my support, my life. You brought that child," she gestured to Bella, "into our home before you even moved out. You thought I was weak because I was quiet." She stood up. She was wearing heels and she met his eyes levelly. "You mistook silence for submission. That was your fatal error." Richard looked around. He saw the board members at table 2 watching him. He saw Arthur Pennyworth holding up his phone, the screen displaying a vote submitted confirmation. "Arthur," Richard pleaded, "you didn't." "Business is business, Richard," Arthur shrugged, "and Victoria has a better business plan." Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. Then it buzzed again and again. A cascade of notifications. He pulled it out. It was the company internal server. Alert Emergency Board. Resolution passed. Subject removal of CEO. Status effective immediately. Richard stared at the screen. The color drained from his face until he looked like a wax figure. You fired me," he whispered. "At my own gala." "Technically," Victoria said, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "It's not your gala anymore. The company paid for it. And since you're no longer an employee of the company—" She gestured to the head of security, a man named Miller, not the CTO, the other Miller who had been Richard's personal bodyguard for 5 years. "Mr. Miller," Victoria said, "please escort the trespasser off the premises. He doesn't have a ticket." Miller looked at Richard. He looked at the new boss. He looked at the old boss who had screamed at him yesterday for opening the car door too slowly. "Yes, ma'am," Miller said. He stepped forward. "Mr. Harrington, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "You work for me," Richard screamed. "I work for Harrington Tech," Miller corrected. "And Mrs. Harrington, sorry, Miss Sinclair Cole. I apologize, I don't know the new name yet." "Just Miss Harrington for now," Victoria said. "I'm taking the name back. It's my brand after all." Richard was paralyzed. He looked at Bella. Bella looked at the security guard, then at Richard, then at the exit. "Richard," Bella asked, Are we leaving?" "He is," Victoria said. "You can stay, Bella. I believe they're serving dessert soon. And since you're so fond of sugar daddies, I'm sure you can find a new one here. Just not at this table." Bella looked at Richard, who was currently being gently but firmly steered by the elbow toward the exit. She looked at the room full of billionaires. She looked at the dessert cart rolling out. Bella sat back down. Richard watched her sit. The betrayal hit him harder than the firing. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse, to burn it all down, but the heavy oak doors were already closing in front of him. He was outside, on the sidewalk, in the cold. Inside, the band struck up a jazz number. Victoria sat back down. Sebastian poured her a fresh glass of champagne. "That went well," Sebastian noted. "The night is young," Victoria replied. "We haven't even gotten to the part where I audit the offshore accounts." "True," Sebastian said. "But first," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I promised you a real upgrade." The velvet box sat on the table between them, a small, dark island amidst the crystal and silver. The room, which had been buzzing with the electric thrill of the boardroom coup, quieted down. Humans are simple creatures. They love a power struggle, but they love a romance even more. Sebastian didn't open the box immediately. He rested his hand over Victoria's, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "You know," Sebastian said, his voice low enough that only Victoria and the very attentive Arthur Pennyworth could hear. "When I found you on that terrace in Ravello 3 months ago, you weren't thinking about revenge. You were thinking about ending it." Victoria's breath hitched. It was true. After Richard had served the papers delivered by a drone, the ultimate sterile insult, Victoria had fled. She had gone to the Amalfi Coast, not to eat pasta and pray, but to disappear. She had felt erased. 20 years of code, of raising children, of managing Richard's moods and ego, all for nothing. She had stood on the terrace of her rental villa, looking at the cliffs, wondering if anyone would notice if she just slipped. "I was lost," Victoria admitted softly. "You were invisible," Sebastian corrected, "because you had spent a lifetime making yourself small, so a small man could feel big." He looked at the empty stage where Richard had stood. "I didn't fall in love with you because you were Richard Harrington's scorned wife, Victoria. I fell in love with you because when we started talking about cryptographic ledgers over that bottle of cheap house wine, you were the most brilliant person I had ever met. You corrected my math on a napkin." Victoria smiled, a genuine watery smile. "Your math was terrible, Sebastian." "It was," he chuckled. "And that's when I knew. I knew you were the architect. Richard was just the scaffolding, and scaffolding is replaceable." He flipped the velvet box open. The gasp from the surrounding tables was audible. It wasn't a diamond. It was a sapphire, dark and deep as the ocean at midnight, surrounded by a halo of rare white platinum. It was understated elegant and worth more than the entire gross domestic product of a small island nation. "This is a sapphire from the Kashmir mines," Sebastian said. "They are depleted now. You can't get them anymore. They are rare, resilient, and under the right light they outshine everything else." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Victoria, be my partner. In business, yes. We have an empire to rebuild. But be my partner in life. Let's show them what a real power couple looks like." Victoria looked at the ring, then at Sebastian. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a wife or a mother or a business partner. She felt seen. "Yes," she whispered. Sebastian stood up and pulled her into a kiss. It wasn't a showy, open-mouthed performance like Richard and Bella's displays. It was firm, passionate, and grounded. The room erupted. This time the applause was genuine. The elite of New York loves a winner, and Victoria had just won everything. Outside on the cold pavement of 61st Street, Richard Harrington was watching the live stream on his cracked iPhone screen. He had been shoved out the side door by Miller, his own bodyguard. He was standing in the wind, shivering in his tuxedo. His coat check ticket was still in his pocket, but the coat was inside. He watched the pixelated video of Sebastian kissing Victoria. He saw the flash of the sapphire. He saw Arthur Pennyworth clapping. He saw his former board members raising a toast. "That's my wife," Richard muttered to the empty street. That was my life." He tried to open the door again, but it was locked. He banged on the glass. "Let me in. I left my wallet in there. I need my car keys." Miller appeared on the other side of the glass. He didn't open the door. He just shook his head slowly and pointed to the street. "Go away, Richard." Richard pulled out his phone to call Bella. She was still inside. She could bring him his keys. She could bring him his coat. She would fix this. Bella loved him. She had told him so every time he bought her a purse. He dialed her number. It rang, and rang, and rang. Inside the ballroom, Bella Sinclair looked at her phone buzzing on the table. The screen said, "Hubby Rich." She looked at the phone with a sneer. She looked at the happy couple at table 1. She looked at the waiter presenting the bill for the vintage champagne Richard had ordered for the table earlier. 3 bottles of Dom Perignon, totaling $15,000. Bella silenced the call. Bella Sinclair was a survivor. You don't get from a trailer park in Florida to the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel without having a certain cockroach-like resilience. She knew the game. The game was simple. Attach yourself to the biggest host feed until the host is dry or a bigger host comes along, and then jump. Richard had been a great host. He was needy, insecure, and rich. Perfect. But now Richard was outside, presumably crying on the sidewalk. And inside the atmosphere had shifted from gala to coronation, and Bella was decidedly not the queen. She needed an exit strategy. She smoothed her red dress, reapplied her lipstick using her phone camera, ignoring another call from Richard, and stood up. She grabbed her clutch. She needed to find a new target. She scanned the room. Her eyes landed on Marcus Thorne, a hedge fund manager at table 4. He was recently divorced, flashy, and had been eyeing her all night. Bella walked over, adding a sway to her hips that usually stopped traffic. "Hi, Marcus," she purred, sliding into the empty seat next to him. "Crazy night, huh? Richard is such a drama queen. I'm so embarrassed." Marcus looked at her. He didn't smile. He took a sip of his whiskey. "You're embarrassed?" Marcus asked. "Bella, you stood on stage and laughed while he humiliated his wife. The same wife who just took control of the company I have $40 million invested in." Bella blinked. "So she's just a bitter old woman. We can still have fun. I thought maybe we could go to the after-party at One Oak." Marcus laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. Bella read the room. "You're toxic. If I'm seen with you tonight, Victoria Harrington pulls her accounts from my firm tomorrow morning. Sebastian Cole blacklists me from his shipping routes." He signaled a waiter. "Check, please." He looked back at Bella. "You're radioactive, sweetheart. The Mistress gig only works when the man has the power. Richard has nothing, which means you have nothing." Bella's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. I have my own brand. I have 1 million followers on Instagram. You have bots, Marcus said, standing up. And by tomorrow, you won't even have those. Good luck, Bella. He walked away. Bella looked around. Every time she made eye contact with someone, they looked away. The women smirked. The men checked their watches. She was completely isolated in a room of 500 people. Panic started to set in. Real panic. The waiter arrived at her table. "Excuse me, miss," the waiter said, holding a leather folio. Mr. Harrington left without settling the tab for the table. The manager insists the bill be paid before anyone else from the party leaves. Bella looked at the bill. $18,400. Service included. "Put it on Richard's account," Bella snapped. "He has a house account here." "The account has been suspended, miss," the waiter said politely. "Card declined. Insufficient funds." Bella felt cold. Insufficient funds, Richard Harrington. I don't have that kind of money," Bella stammered. "We accept Apple Pay," the waiter offered helpfully. Bella grabbed her purse. I need to go get my boyfriend. He's outside." She bolted. She ran past the waiter, past the security, and pushed through the heavy doors. The cold night air hit her like a slap. Richard was pacing the sidewalk, looking manic. His tie was undone, his hair was wind-blown. When he saw Bella, his face lit up with pathetic hope. "Bella. Oh, thank God." Richard rushed toward her. "Baby, give me your phone. Mine is dying and my lawyers aren't picking up. We need to call an Uber. We need to go to the Hamptons' house. We'll regroup there." Bella stopped. She looked at Richard. Really looked at him. Without the spotlight, without the entourage, without the power. He looked old. He looked tired. He looked like a 50-year-old man in a rental suit. "The Hamptons' house?" Bella asked sharply. "Is that in your name?" Richard blinked. "Well, technically it's in the family trust, which Victoria manages, but I'm sure I can fight for access." "So you can't go there," Bella said. "What about the penthouse?" "Company property," Richard admitted, looking down. They might have changed the locks already." Bella let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "So you're homeless. You're a homeless billionaire." "It's temporary," Richard pleaded. "Bella, I'm a genius. I built it once, I'll build it again. We can start over. Just you and me. I have a checking account with maybe 50 grand in it. We can go to Mexico. I have ideas for a crypto startup." Bella looked at him with pure disgust. The mask of the adoring girlfriend slipped off completely. "Mexico 50 grand, Bella screeched. "Richard, my skincare routine costs 50 grand a year. I'm not going to Mexico to live in a hut with you while you code on a stolen laptop." But you said you loved me," Richard stammered. "You said I was your soulmate. You said I was the king." "I loved the jet, Richard," Bella shouted, not caring who heard. "I loved the black card. I loved the attention. You think I slept with you because of your personality. You talk about yourself for 3 hours straight, and you chew with your mouth open." Richard stepped back as if slapped. "Bella, don't Bella me," she hissed. "You're a loser, Richard. You lost your company, you lost your money, and you lost your wife. And guess what? You just lost me too." She pulled out her phone and opened the Uber app. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "I'm going to stay with my promoter friend in Soho," Bella said. "And tomorrow I'm going to sell the story of how you manipulated me to TMZ. I bet I can get at least 10 grand for the exclusive." An Uber pulled up, a beat-up Toyota Camry. Bella opened the door. "Bella, please." Richard reached for her hand. I have nobody. Bella pulled her hand away. Should have thought of that before you toasted me, Richie. She slammed the door. The car drove off, leaving Richard standing in a puddle of dirty street water. He turned back to the hotel. Through the glass windows, he could see the warm, golden glow of the ballroom. He saw the silhouettes of people dancing. He saw a tall man spinning a woman in a blue dress. They looked happy. Richard sat down on the curb. He put his head in his hands. And then it started to rain. 1 year later. The Davos World Economic Forum is where the masters of the universe gather to decide the fate of the world over hot chocolate and geopolitical strategy. The air is thin, the snow is thick, and the security is tighter than a drum. Inside the main Congress Hall, the room was packed to capacity. The screen behind the stage displayed a simple, elegant logo, VS Technologies, formerly Harrington Tech. Victoria stood on the stage. She looked different from the woman in the red dress at the Pierre Hotel, and worlds away from the invisible wife in the beige pantsuit. She wore a cream cashmere turtleneck and tailored trousers, projecting a kind of Steve Jobs meets Coco Chanel authority. She didn't need to shout. The microphone was perfectly calibrated to catch the warmth in her voice. "Efficiency," Victoria said, clicking the remote. A graph appeared on the screen, the line soaring upward like a mountain peak. It isn't about moving fast and breaking things. That was the philosophy of the last decade. It was the philosophy of ego. She paused, letting the words sink in. True innovation is about building things that last. It's about sustainable code, sustainable growth, and sustainable relationships. In the last 12 months, VS Technologies has patched over 5,000 critical vulnerabilities in the global shipping infrastructure. We didn't promise you flying cars. We promised you that the supply chain wouldn't collapse. And we delivered. The applause was thunderous. It wasn't the polite, fearful applause Richard used to receive. This was the applause of relief. The global markets trusted her. Sitting in the front row, Sebastian Cole watched her with a look of utter devotion. He held their 6-month-old golden retriever puppy, Ledger, on a leash near his feet. Sebastian Cole could bring a dog into Davos. Who was going to stop him? He wasn't the money man anymore. He was the partner. They had merged their assets, their lives, and their talents. Victoria looked down at him and smiled. It was a private moment shared in front of 3,000 people. Meanwhile, in a coffee shop in Jersey City, Richard Harrington adjusted his webcam. The lighting in his studio apartment was terrible, casting long, unflattering shadows under his eyes. He had aged 10 years in 12 months. His hair was thinning, and the stress of 4 consecutive lawsuits had etched deep lines around his mouth. "Hey guys, welcome back to the channel," Richard said, forcing a manic energy into his voice. "It's your boy Rich Hustle here to talk about the mindset of a winner. Today we're going to talk about how to bounce back when the Matrix tries to delete you." He glanced at the viewer count on his live stream, 14 watching. 3 of them were bots. 1 was his lawyer watching to make sure he didn't violate the NDA again. "People ask me," Richard continued, picking up a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, pretending it was an espresso. "Rich, how do you stay so positive?" And I tell them, "It's about vision. You gotta see what others can't." He glanced at the other tab open on his laptop. It was the live stream of Victoria's speech at Davos. He saw the headline on Bloomberg, "Victoria Harrington Cole, the billionaire who fixed the internet." He saw the ring on her finger. He saw the way she stood, tall, unburdened, free. A comment popped up in his chat, user 123. Aren't you the guy who got kicked out of his own party, LOL? Richard banned the user. His hand was shaking. He had tried to fight them. Oh, how he had tried. He sued for wrongful termination. Victoria's lawyers buried him in discovery paperwork until he ran out of cash. He sued for his share of the marital assets. The forensic accountants found the offshore accounts. He had hidden the ones he used to buy Bella's jewelry. And the judge not only awarded everything to Victoria, but fined Richard for perjury. He was toxic. No venture capital firm would touch him. He was the man who tanked a unicorn because he was too busy chasing a skirt. He was a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Don't forget to like and subscribe, Richard mumbled, his energy fading. Buy my course, link in bio. He ended the stream. He sat in the silence of his small apartment, listening to the sirens outside. He looked at the photo on his desk, an old photo from 20 years ago. Him and Victoria eating pizza on the floor of their first office. They looked tired but happy. They were a team. He turned the photo face down. And what of Bella Sinclair was indeed in the news that day, but not on Bloomberg. She was on page 6 of a tabloid in the Where Are They Now column. After the gala, Bella had tried to sell her story. She got a few interviews, a few $1,000s, and 15 minutes of sympathy. But the public is fickle. Once they learned she had mocked Victoria's dead weight moments before the tables turned, the sympathy evaporated. She became a meme, the gold digger who dug too deep. She had moved to Los Angeles, hoping to pivot into reality TV. Currently, she was sitting in the lobby of a plastic surgeon's office in Beverly Hills, waiting for a consultation. She wasn't the patient. She was the receptionist. Ms. Kardashian will see you now, Bella said into the phone, her voice flat. She looked at the magazine on the coffee table. Victoria was on the cover of Time magazine. Bella felt a pang of something sharp in her chest. Regret. No. Bella didn't do regret. Envy. Pure corrosive envy. She looked at her reflection in the glass partition. The stress of the last year had taken a toll. She couldn't afford the treatments anymore. She was just another pretty face in a city of beautiful people, answering phones for men who reminded her of Richard. Men who would never, ever marry her. Back at Davos. The speech was over. Victoria walked off stage, adrenaline humming in her veins. Sebastian was waiting for her. He handed her a bottle of water and a heavy wool coat. You were magnificent, he said. I was honest, she replied. They walked out of the Congress Center into the crisp Swiss air. The snow was falling softly. A black car was waiting for them, the engine purring. Where to? Sebastian asked, opening the door for her. Victoria looked back at the venue. She thought about the life she had left behind. The walking on eggshells, the shrinking herself to fit into Richard's pocket, the fear of being old. She looked at Sebastian, who looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. She thought about the code she was writing tonight, a new project, something just for fun. Let's go home, Victoria said. I have an idea for a new algorithm. Does it involve destroying my ego? Sebastian teased. Only if necessary, she laughed. As the car drove away, disappearing into the whiteout of the snow, Victoria didn't look back. She didn't check her phone. She didn't wonder what Richard was doing. Because the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. And Victoria Harrington Cole was finally blissfully indifferent. And that, my friends, is the story of how Richard Harrington learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Be careful who you call dead weight, because they might be the only thing anchoring you to the ground. It's a brutal reminder that arrogance is a fragile thing. Richard thought his value came from his money, his title, and the young woman on his arm. But his true value had been the partner he spent 20 years ignoring. When he cut her loose, he didn't fly. He floated away into nothingness. Victoria didn't just get revenge. She got justice. She didn't stoop to screaming or fighting. She simply took her intellectual property, her dignity and her brilliance, and walked out the door. She proved that the best revenge isn't ruin, it's success. Now I have to ask you, do you think Richard deserved to lose everything, or was the punishment too harsh? And what about Bella? Was she just a player in the game, or did she get exactly what was coming to her? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you're Team Victoria, drop a diamond emoji. If you have a tiny bit of sympathy for Richard, drop a chart down emoji. If you enjoyed this story of karma high-stakes business and ultimate betrayal, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay humble, stay loyal, and remember the person you step on. Today might be the person you need tomorrow. Thanks for watching.